On the pasuk v'Noach ben sheish me'os shana v'hamabul hoya mayim ala oretz. Noach is 600 years when the mabul starts. The Medrash says that the mabul was not counted, the year of the mabul is not counted as part of the calculation of years. Meaning to say, as the Mefarshim explain, that the year of the mabul is not taken into consideration when Noach's total life, the amount of Noach's life is calculated. How do we see this? So when Hashem is counting Noach's years, this is the way the Mefarshim explain, he's not counting the years of the mabul, because if we should calculate all of Noach's years together, it should actually be 951 years if we would count the year of the mabul. Because the pasuk says that Noach is 600 years old when the mabul starts, which sounds like Noach is 600 years old already. Noach ben sheish me'os shana v'hamabul hoya. The pasuk says vayehi ba'achaz b'sheish me'os shana, that in 601 years the water dries up. We also have a pasuk that tells us vayechi Noach, that Noach lives 350 years after the mabul. So now, again, we have 600 years until the mabul. We have a year of the mabul. We then have 350 years after the mabul. So it should have been total 951 years. But the pasuk actually says, Vayehi kol yemei Noach, that the years that Noach lives is 950 years. But it should have been 951 years. That tells us that the year of the mabul is not calculated as part of his life. And the Mefarshim explained the reason for that would be, since it was a year of anguish, of pain, of tzara, so it's not being calculated as part of his life. So in fact, he lives 951 years, if we would calculate all the years, but the Torah is calling it 950 years. The Rebbe says, we discussed a number of times, that from the fact that Rashi in a number of places in his Pirush ala Torah uses the expression about certain things, when there's a certain difficulty, and Rashi does not have an answer. Rashi says, Lo yadaiti, I don't know the explanation for this, or similar expressions. That teaches us that wherever there is some sort of difficulty in Pshutei Shel Mikra, Rashi is dealing with it in one way or another. In other words, either he explains it, or he writes that he doesn't know the answer, or something like that. So if he does not say that, it must be that it's something that's self-explanatory, something that we understand on our own, or we can understand it from this pasuk itself, or from other psukim, or Rashi's previously, before this pasuk. So Rashi will always deal with it if there's a difficulty in one way or another. According to this, says the Rebbe, we need to understand this idea of the total of the amount of Noach's years doesn't seem to fit with the actual years that the Torah tells us how much years there are before the mabul and how much year there are after the mabul, which then forces the Medrash to say that the year of the mabul is not counted as part of the calculation. So this problem seems to be an open problem and an open contradiction within the psukim itself. And yet Rashi doesn't explain anything in Chumash on this. Now we cannot say that Rashi is just learning like the Medrash and just is taking it for granted that the year of the mabul is just not calculated, because on the contrary, this is such a tremendous chidush, Rashi would have to say it explicitly. We can't say that Rashi is just taking for granted that we're going to understand it. Especially, says the Rebbe, that the individual calculation of the year in the mabul is very specifically told to us in the Torah. As said before, first it says the mabul started when Noach is 600 years old, and then it says that 601 years the mabul is over, and again afterwards there's another 350 years, so there seems to be 951 years. Why is the Torah telling us it's 950 years? So the Rebbe says we could explain it in the following way. In the pasuk it says, Bishnas sheish me'os shana l'chaye Noach, that in the 600th year of Noach, that's when the water started coming out. Now the simple meaning of the word bishnas within the year, in the middle of the year, is in the middle of the year. And therefore, says the Rebbe, we could actually translate B'shnas Mei Shana not as we understood before, once Noach turned 600 years old, but rather what we mean is in the beginning. B'shnas could mean in the beginning of the year, but in the beginning of the year doesn't mean once Noach turned 600 years old, but in the beginning of his 600th year. That means once he turns 599, going into the 600th year, so a little bit after 599, that is when the Mabul started. And since the pasuk says Bishnash Sheish Meyos Shana, that tells us that when the pasuk says V'Noach ben Sheish Meyos Shana v'Mabul Hoya Mayim al Haaretz, that this pasuk, when it says Noach is 600, so what it means is the same idea. When Noach is within his 600th year. Or the Rebbe says, you could also say slightly different, that when Noach turned 600, v'hamabul hoya, the mabul was already on the ground. That means the mabul was already previously there. And when the pasuk says, v'yihi ba'achaz v'sheish meyos shana charvu hamayim, when it says in 601 years, the mabul, the water dried up, again, it doesn't mean 601 full years, but rather it could mean once it was 600 and a bit, because it's already within the 601st year. So therefore, this is explaining to us where that year disappeared to, because again, Noach is 599 and a bit when the Mabul starts. He's 600 and a bit when the Mabul finishes. And when the Torah comes to the Sachakal, to the calculation of all of the years of Noach, so the Torah is counting full years. It's not going to count that little bit after 601. And therefore, so when we calculate Noach's years, there's 950 years, because there's the 600 and a bit years till after the Mabul, as we said, because it was 599 and a bit when the Mabul started, 600 and a bit when the Mabul finished. So we're just counting the 600 years plus the 350 years after the Mabul, which equals 950. However, says the Rebbe, this explanation is still not enough, not sufficient. Why? So the Rebbe quotes a Rashi where Hashem is telling Noach ki liyamim oid shiva, that in 7 days the Mabul is going to start. Rashi explains there that these are the 7 days of Avelus after Mesushelach passed away. Rashi says, Tsevach HaShoiv, if you go and you figure out the years of Mesushelach, you will work out, you'll see that they actually finish B'shnas Tov Reish Shana L'chaye Noach, when Noach is 600. How does this calculation work? Rashi doesn't give us the calculation. What's the calculation? So Mesushelach, the Torah says, lives in total 969 years. Mesushelach was 187 when he gave birth to Lemech, who's Noach's father. Lemech is 182 when he gives birth to Noach. This is what the Torah says. These two numbers together, 187, again, when Mesushelach gives birth to Lemech, and another 182 when Lemech gives birth to Noach, we're up to the year 369 years out of Mesushelach's life by the time Noach is born. If that's the case, so Mesushelach's total amount of years, which is 969 years, finishes off when Noach is 600. Because again, we have these 369 years by the time Noach is born, plus 600, that is the 969 years that Mesushelach lives. So if Mesushelach passes away just before the Mabul, then when the Torah says that when Noach is 600 years when the Mabul starts, it could no longer mean he's 599. It actually has to mean now that Noach is 600 years old. The Rebbe says, simply, we would be able to explain this problem in the following way. In other words, where this year is disappearing to. And the Rebbe says like this: when the Torah speaks about the age of each person giving birth to his son, so in our case, again, it would be the 187 years and then the 182 years. It does not mean that on the very day that the father turned 187 or 182, that is the day that he now gave birth to the next child. that the Torah mentions. Because if that would be the case, it would then turn out that Shes and Enosh and all the following generations that the Torah enumerates and says, so-and-so lived X amount of years and gave birth to his child, you would then have to say that each and every one of them was giving birth on exactly the same day that their father was born. In other words, the father is born on a particular day, and then it says he lived a certain amount of years and he gives birth to his son. That means it's again exactly on his birthday. And going back all the way to Adam, that would mean they were all born on the very same day that Adam is created, which is Rosh Hashanah, which is obviously very, very difficult to say that. So rather, what does the Torah mean when it says that so-and-so gave birth when he was this age? It means after he was already this particular amount of years. So let's say he turned 182. So somewhere after he turns 182, somewhere throughout that year, he gives birth. So here is the problem. Or not the problem, here is actually going to be the solution. Since Chelek is 187 years old when he gives birth to Lemech, but we just explained 187 means plus a bit. And Lemech is 182 when he gives birth to Noach, so it's again another bit. So if we count that, along with the little bit that we also said, that when we said Noach is 600, it means 600. It meant 599 and a bit. Again, there was another bit. So all of these remainders together could actually account for another whole year, which would now help us with the years of Mesushelach, which we said before we seem to be missing a year. But now, with this calculation that each one of them is not exactly 187, 182, and exactly 599, going into the 600th year, but each one is another little bit, so that will now account for this extra year. But the Rebbe has a problem with this saying that there's always these bit of extra years. Why? In regards to the Chet of the Doir HaFlaga, Rashi tells us, what was the concern of the Doir HaFlaga? This is one of Rashi's explanations. Rashi says that they thought to themselves, they said that once every 1,656 years, the heavens collapse. Just like it was in the times of the Mabul. In other words, the Mabul came at the year 1,656. The Doir HaFlaga was concerned this is going to happen again, and this is why they're building the tower and the city, etc. Now, if we look at this number, 1,656, this is actually going to be the exact number if we count all of those generations. How old Adam is when he has his son Shes, how old Shes is when he has his son Enosh, all the way till Noach. So it is an exact amount of years, no remainders. Meaning to say, if we're going to say that there's the number of years that the Torah counts is with these remainders, and the Torah is just not mentioning it, then by each one of these 10 generations, there should have been some more time, either days, weeks, or months, that the Torah is not counting in this general amount of years. So when the Torah says a certain amount of years that someone gave birth, it's not counting the extra months or whatever it is. The Rebbe says, logic dictates that if we're speaking about these 10 generations that obviously all had long life, so all of the remainders of these years, these extra amounts in each one of these years, that should have added up to quite a bit, the Rebbe says it should have added up to at least more than a year, perhaps even more. If that's the case, then it shouldn't have been 1,656 years when the Mabul starts, but it should have been, again, at least another year, 1,657 or perhaps even more. Which tells us then that seemingly this cheshbon that we made before, that there's always a bit of remainder, is not necessarily a true statement. So the Rebbe tries another approach, but the Rebbe is going to say that Rashi can't be going with this. The Rebbe says seemingly we would be able to say that the calculation of 1,656 years that we're speaking about when the Mabul happens is because the age of the people that are counted in the Torah are not actually going by their birthdays, but going, as Rashi puts this in Parshas Kisisa, a calculation that goes based on Shnois Olam, based on the years that of the world. In other words, calendar years. In other words, when we're counting the specific amount of years of a person, how old a person was, we don't mean exactly from his birthday till this particular date, but rather we're going based on the particular year that we're in. In other words, so by way of example, the Rebbe does not give this example, but just to clarify. So let's just say, we say that Adam Arishoin gives birth to Shes when he's 130 years old. So it doesn't necessarily mean, obviously we said already, it doesn't mean the day he turns 130. But 130 means 130 years into the world. It's Shnas, Kuf Lamed, into the world. And then when it says Shes gives birth at a certain age to his son, again, we're counting just based on the years of the world, based on Rosh Hashanah. The Rebbe says this is something that Rashi gives a similar sort of calculation in Parshas Kisiso when discussing the ages of the Yidden. And therefore, let's just go back how this would have clarified the answer, how this would have answered anything. So the Rebbe says, therefore, we wouldn't be counting any remainders because it's not a matter of how old a person is. It all matters. We're just going based on the age of the world, and we're just adding these amount of years for each person of when he gave birth to the next one, and it doesn't really matter when in the year it was. But the Rebbe says it's a very big doichik to say that that's what Rashi, this is the way Rashi would learn in our parsha without specifying it very, very clearly, because in Pshutei Shomika this is a tremendous chidush to say that when Torah is giving the particular life of an individual person, we don't mean his actual age, but we're speaking about only based on the calendar years from Rosh Hashanah until Rosh Hashanah. So the Rebbe says, V'habir bazeh, the explanation is, in Derech HaPshat, when the Torah says that a person is a specific age, and not like by Moshe Rabbeinu where it says, Ben me'eh ve'esrim shana anoichi hayoim, when it's specifically saying, today I turned 120 years old. So when Torah generally gives an age of a person, it only means that this is his approximate age. Meaning to say, he might be a little bit older than that. So, up to half a year older, because, or a half a year younger. Because otherwise you would go to the next year. In other words, he's approximately whatever age we're talking about. So if we're speaking about Noach, for example, again, if we'll just use that as an example, when we speak about 600, it could be a little bit younger, it could be a little bit older. The Rebbe says, but Pashtus, we're going according to the Roiv, even of a year. In other words, we're just speaking about whatever age we give, we're just going in the closest age that's closest to his birthday. So it could be a little bit older and a little bit younger. Now I just want to interrupt over here for a minute because the Rebbe does not completely specify how this answers our question. I think, if I'm understanding correctly, what the Rebbe is saying over here is that when we spoke about Noach's age, and we had this discrepancy and this problem, is it 600 plus 350, and then what happened to the year in middle? So I think the way we're understanding it now is that the 600 didn't necessarily mean exactly 600. It could have been 599 and a half. And the same thing when we're speaking about later, the 350 years after the Mabul, again, it could be 350 and a bit, or 350 and a half almost. And in that way, we have room for that extra year that seemed to have gone missing in the middle for the Mabul. The Rebbe continues the Sicha and says, this will actually now make the cheshbon of 1,656 years before that we spoke about, will now make that even simpler and more straightforward to understand. We asked before, what happens to all the remainders of all these people? So the Rebbe says, if we go with this idea that the Torah, when it says an age, it could be a little bit younger or a little bit older. So the Rebbe says, b'pashtus al derech haragel, simply just like there could be generations where the Torah is not counting the little bit over a year. So if the Torah said 500, it could be 500 and a little bit, 500 and a half or close to a half. I'm just giving you that example, does not say this in the Sicha. So in exactly the same way, there could also be days or months that are less than that total amount, but again, less than a half a year. And again, the Torah is not accounting for that. Because again, the Torah is just going approximate closest age. And therefore, in total, b'sach hakoil, the numbers are going to even out. In other words, because, again, we're speaking about 10 generations, and the Torah gave ages for each one, but just like in some cases, the ages means that age plus a little bit, in some cases, the ages are that age minus a little bit, but all in all, it will straighten out, it will even out, it will average out. And therefore, it's not going to be this problem of where all these extra months and years, and we could still say it fits with the age of the world as well, and therefore it's still the 656 years, exactly as the world is, the same thing with these 10 generations. The Rebbe says, V'yesh levair oid bazeh, there's another point in the explanation that can be made, but it's not so much al derech hapshat, the Rebbe says. But by first prefacing, generally, the reason why the Torah counts all of these individual generations, the age of how old each father was when the child was born. So what's the reason simply? Because seemingly you could ask, L'may nafka, what difference does it make how old the father was when he had a particular child? So the Rebbe says it's in order that we should be able to get an understanding of when the different events of Torah are happening. Based on this, if the main point is to not so much about the age of the person, but it's to give us context and to be able to understand the age of the world, what's happening in each year of the world's history, says the Rebbe, according to that, we could actually say that the number that the Torah says in connection to an individual giving birth to his child, if we speak about just the age of the person, not in relation to the world's age, but as far as the individual child, the individual person, the age that the Torah says could actually range to almost a 2-year range. Meaning to say, a person is supposed to turn a certain age that year. So let's just use Noach as an example again. We said he's in his 600th year. So really, 600 can mean almost the whole previous year when he's turning 600. So 599 plus some. It can also mean almost the whole following year when he is 600 years old. Or the Rebbe gives an example. When we said 187 years, where it says Chelek is 187 years old when he has his son. It can mean when he's entering his 187th year. So he's 186 and a bit. It could also mean that he's almost finished being 187. In other words, he's almost 188. Because again, where the focus is more about the age of the world, where in the world's years these fit. Even though this is going to cause that we're not going to know the exact age of how old the father was when he gave birth to this child. But again, what the main focus was to know the number of how old the world is, the world's history calendar. Because the Sachakal, when we calculate all the years together that the Torah is telling us, of so-and-so gave birth to so-and-so at this age, so-and-so gave birth to so-and-so in this age, this altogether, this general calculation, is going to tell us where we're up to in the age of the world, or at least, approximately, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less than a year away. Says the Rebbe, the Tam Panimi of why the Torah is so particular that we should know the age of the world, the years of the world. So we're going to understand this by first prefacing what says in the Medrash. The Medrash speaks about a goy called Akilas, and he wanted to become a geir. And he's mentioning some of the qualities of the Yidden of why he wants to become a geir. And one of the things he says is Hakoton Shabam, that even the smallest one amongst them know how old the world is, how many years passed since the world was created. Says the Rebbe, since one of the milus of the Yidden is this idea, that's this idea of knowing the age of the world, that this is the reason for someone to become a geir, it's understood that this is not a matter of just knowing how wise the Yidden are, but it's something, a quality that's very, very strongly connected to Yiddishkeit itself. This is why he wants to become a Yid. And the explanation is, because the emunah in Chidush Ha'olam, this idea, our emunah, that the Eibishter created the world at a particular time, this is one of the Yesodis of Torah, one of the most fundamental in Yonam and Torah. The Ramban actually says that this is Shoyresh emunah. Someone that does not believe in this and thinks that the world just always was always here, is a koifer be'ikr and doesn't have Torah at all. Says the Rebbe, within emunah itself, there can also be various different levels. You can have a person that's mayun be'emunah shleim, he has complete faith, but still he doesn't have that absolute 100% clarity in the matter. In other words, even the emunah is by him not with such absolute clear certainty and knowledge. Similar to what we have, the Maimer Azal says, you can't compare someone that heard something to someone that saw something. Now, even when someone heard something, he can also be sure that it's true, and nevertheless, it's not with that same emes as through the Re'iyah. In a similar way over here with the Emunah. In other words, you can have the Emunah, but it can be with a much greater clarity. And this is the pshat, this is the chidush, when the Medrash says that this guy says, HaKatan Shabem Yudei, that even the smallest one of them knows how many years there are from when the world was created. The idea of this being is that they're emunah by the Yidden, including this fundamental aspect of emunah, as the Ramban says, in the fact that the Eibishter created the world, is so absolutely certain and clear, even by the Katan, that he knows the exact time of when Hashem created the world. And this is why the Torah is elaborating so much with all these numbers of the generation to actually, in fact, tell us exactly the amount of years of the world.